Michael is an associate professor of economics and also the faculty director of the University Honors Program. He joined the faculty at UD in 1992 after completing his PhD in economics at UCLA, with concentrations in industrial organization, game theory, and the economics of uncertainty and information. That is a great thing. I wish we had degrees with titles like that here. So, Michael actually has a record for the most contribution to this symposium. He has spoken at, this is his third appearance here. My interpretation is that if you call the economics department and ask for somebody who can speak about Nobel quality work, they think of Michael. Anyway, thank you.
So hopefully I won't disappoint Doug tonight in giving that introduction. Speaking with Bruno earlier, it was a good year for the French. I'm going to speak about a Frenchman, Jean Tirole, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, which is actually the one that's not really a Nobel Prize. It's the one the bank created in memory of Nobel. So Jean Tirole won the Nobel Prize for advances in our understanding of market power and regulation, and I'm going to try and give you a little sense of what that means by starting with some historical context. So if I was doing this in class, I would ask if anyone knows what this is. The Iron Bridge, right? So if you're a tourist and you buy into the British tourist thing, this is in Shropshire, England, they would say this is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the first major iron structure, still in place today. And if you talk to historians and economic historians, they would say they don't like the term Industrial Revolution because it took about 120 years. I'm going to walk through a little bit of that. About 80 years after the Industrial Revolution began, we started to think about market power and competition because of one thing: hogs. Okay. And this is a picture of the Union stockyards in Chicago in the 1870s. As technological innovations were more widely adopted following things like the Iron Bridge, we began to see increased market concentration, and this is highlighted by the hog-producing industry in the 1870s, 1880s in Chicago. Combine these hogs with refrigerated rail cars, which could transport processed meats to major population centers in the East Coast from Chicago, and enter Professor Moneybags, or the so-called bosses of the Senate. Right, this is when we began to see major trusts forming, and when economists started to worry a little bit about and think about what trusts meant. Prior to this, much of economic analysis was really based on Adam Smith's idea of an invisible hand guiding resources to their most efficient use. We began to see that wasn't always going to occur as these more centralized and concentrated markets evolved. Fortunately, not everyone in the Senate was enamored of these bosses, so anybody know who that is? No. The brother of General Sherman from Civil War fame. This is Senator John Sherman from Ohio, who authored the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was enacted by Congress in 1890. The Sherman Antitrust Act governed competition policy for essentially the next 80-plus years and was based primarily on economic theories that strongly indicated that competition is good and results in efficient allocation of resources, while monopoly, on the other hand, is bad. So given these theories, the law heavily focused on supporting competition and limiting mergers, and when oligopoly or monopoly conditions did exist, primarily used price as a regulatory tool. In short, regulatory policy was fairly simplistic throughout this period. To see why this might be problematic, suppose we find empirically that industries characterized by a small number of large firms correlate with higher profits than industries characterized by a large number of small firms. Does this imply that firms in more highly concentrated industries are exercising market power to restrict output in a manner that is economically inefficient, similar to the monopoly story? Or might it imply that larger firms simply operate more efficiently and have lower costs? Clearly, the policy recommendations for these two scenarios would be quite different. Prior to Tirole's work, which began in the late 1970s, early 1980s, economists did not have tools to really distinguish between these two scenarios in a meaningful way. So back to the history lesson. Political changes, especially in Europe in the late 1970s and early 1980s, beginning with Margaret Thatcher in the UK, then Helmut Kohl in Germany in the early 80s, and on to France in the mid-1980s under Jacques Chirac, resulted in many European countries pursuing regulatory reforms, privatization, and pro-competitive liberalizations, ultimately leading to the EU and the creation of a single market across continental Europe. These political changes increased awareness of industries dominated by a small number of large firms and the related need for advances in economic theory to understand the implications of privatization and market power for optimal regulatory policy. These changes also happened to coincide with the beginnings of Jean Tirol's career as an economist. He received his PhD in economics in 1981 from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A brief summary of Tirol's contributions might go something like this. Jean Tirole, an applied theoretical mathematical economist, established a new standard of rigor in the fields of industrial organization and regulation. By deploying a consistent conceptual framework over a wide range of issues, primarily using tools of game theory, for which the prize was awarded to Jean Harsanyi, John Nash, and Reinhard Selten in 1994, and mechanism design, for which the prize was awarded to Leonid Hurwitz, Eric Maskin, and Roger Meyerson in 2007, Tirole initiated the creation of an encompassing and coherent theory of industrial organization and economic regulation. Furthermore, Tirole has challenged economists at the frontiers of theoretical research in industrial organization to incorporate greater realism in their analysis. Tirole's focus on the applied relevance of his work has sharpened policy design and led to a greater understanding of how subtle differences between industries can substantially impact regulatory policy. I want to briefly discuss just 3 of the areas in which Tirole has made path-breaking contributions. The first is government procurement. It's a little small, but you can see how much and on what the government spends money on the right there. But one question that arises is, would it make sense for a government to go out and negotiate a fixed price or purchase at a fixed price when buying an F-35 or medical supplies, much like we would do if we go out to the grocery store to buy bread or we go negotiate a price for a new car? The scenario Tirole and co-authors presented is the government, as buyer, recognizes that there's a range of possible production costs for the supplier, but the government can neither observe the firm's actual costs nor efforts by the firm to contain or reduce those costs. Tirole showed that in such a setting, a fixed price contract creates strong incentives for the firm to reduce production costs because the firm keeps all of the gains from reduced costs when they're selling at a fixed price. Unfortunately, a fixed price also provides large transfers of surplus from taxpayers to the firm if the firm's cost is much lower than the government actually anticipated or estimated. Alternatively, if firms' costs are uncertain, a firm may be unwilling to participate in the market unless the fixed payment is very high to account for cost uncertainties. This again implies potentially large transfers from taxpayers to the firm if their costs turn out to be low. Using a mechanism design approach, Lafont and Tirole explicitly characterized the trade-offs between what they called high-powered incentives to reduce costs with low-powered incentives from cost-sharing, which incent firms to participate in a market when faced with cost uncertainties. Given asymmetric information about the supplier's efforts to reduce costs and the supplier's actual costs, the optimal contract includes both a fixed payment and a cost-plus component under which the government pays a fraction of any documented cost overruns. Relatedly, Tirole showed the importance of incorporating the role of time in a dynamic analysis of optimal procurement policies. Prior to Tirole's work, research typically assumed 2 parties should negotiate a contract that both parties agreed to and that both agreed they would never renegotiate. In reality, 3 years into a project, the company might come back to the government and say, the project is harder than we expected, we won't be able to finish unless you give us more money. Given the costs of losing the contract and restarting with a new contractor, it might actually be better for the government to just renegotiate. Tirole showed that despite the fact that government contractors often seem to get really sweet deals, such renegotiation can be in the public interest. Another area in which he's made major contributions is telecommunications regulation. One thing to note here, I don't know if you can see it, but in the AT&T's logo, we have local and long distance. This raises questions of access pricing as well as optimal regulation for pricing in general. Tirol's insights from the procurement literature already show us that the standard of the time, which was to fix the price at which long-distance services could be sold, has issues of high-powered versus low-powered incentives and therefore is inefficient. So his earlier work could be applied to price regulation if AT&T had been left intact. For the issue of access pricing, we can consider the example of AT&T and the Bell operating companies. Technological advances in the 1970s and early 1980s faced AT&T with new entrants in the long-distance market, but long-distance providers needed access to local exchanges in order to reach customers. This raised questions of what the optimal access price should be. Prior to Tirol's work, the best economic answer was reasonably that we should price access services equal to the marginal cost of providing those services. However, Tirol showed that access prices should also compensate the provider for some part of the fixed costs of providing access. With a series of co-authors, he derived formulas for efficient access pricing. The key to their analysis is to consider the incumbent, AT&T, as subcontracting long-distance services to the new entrant, Sprint in this case. One can then view the incumbent as producing two long-distance services, one internal to the firm and the other outsourced. Intuitively, if an entrant simply steals customers away from the incumbent without creating additional value, this should be reflected in high access prices. Giving the incumbent the responsibility for covering the fixed cost of the network all by itself, on the other hand, and letting entrants free ride by paying very low marginal cost prices would inefficiently distort consumer choices toward the entrant. This also raised questions about pricing in the competitive segment. Again, optimally determining and regulating access price may lead to perverse incentives in the competitive long-distance market. If access is regulated at a price equal to marginal cost, then the incumbent may choose to simply cease operation in the access market, which is clearly inefficient. Alternatively, incorporating fixed costs in the access price creates an incentive for the incumbent to reallocate costs away from the long-distance or competitive sector to the access market, thereby cross-subsidizing costs in the competitive segment, which enables the incumbent to undercut the entrant's price and drive the entrant out of the market. Insights such as these were gleaned from the AT&T case, which ultimately led to divestiture of the Bell operating companies. They also have relevance, as Tirol has shown today, for issues of internet access and net neutrality. Tirol's theories in this area also have relevance to related markets. For example, his work heavily influenced antitrust regulators who put conditions on Comcast's 2011 acquisition of NBC Universal. Comcast, which had market power as a signal carrier, extended its influence by buying an important content provider. The deal, approved by the Federal Communications Commission and the Justice Department, required Comcast to give up management control of the Hulu online video service that NBC shared with Fox, and set conditions for Comcast to share NBC programming with online rivals and traditional competitors such as Dish Network and DirecTV. Again, the impact of Tirol's work in actual market settings. More recently, Tirol's work has shifted to what are called two-sided platforms. Some examples are up here. So Google, the Washington Post, Microsoft, Sony's PlayStation, MasterCard. The thing that these markets all have in common is that the platform, or the market provider here, is actually drawing customers from two sides. The Washington Post, for example, sells news content to readers, and advertising or access to those readers to companies who want to get their product in front of the readers. Similarly, the PlayStation provides games to people who want to play the games on their device, and also provides a market for software developers who are developing those games who can only access customers through the PlayStation platform. So Tirol's work is helping us understand how to deal with what feel like friendly monopolists, like Amazon, Google, and others. Internet firms provide services for free at very low prices. Consumers like this, but are these firms exerting monopoly power in ways we don't always see? People say I'm a user of Facebook, but in reality, they are suppliers to Facebook. Facebook provides in-kind services to members at no cost and then uses these members to sell their actual product to advertisers. Behavior of these two-sided platforms looks suspicious to antitrust authorities. When newspaper content is given away for free, for example, it looks as if the newspaper is preying on its rivals' markets. But free news may simply be one way in which the paper's advertisers can pay readers for their attention. In 2002, 2 years before Google went public or Facebook was founded, Tirol noted that Internet-era companies operate as these two-sided platforms, with consumers on one side and software developers or advertisers on the other. He demonstrated that these industries should be regulated differently depending upon their distinct characteristics. Many internet companies, for instance, give their products away for free, which means that antitrust law built on pricing is irrelevant. But as a result, these companies also often grow very quickly and can become monopolists. In fact, these markets are characterized by a tipping or winner-take-all phenomenon in which network externalities imply that the more customers a company has, the more revenue it generates from advertisers, or the more games that are developed for its game system platform, which leads to a better platform, which leads to more customers, which then leads to more revenue, and we end up with one dominant firm perhaps being the economically efficient outcome. Important questions related to this competition and regulation in these multi-sided platforms are a current area of Tirol's work. Well, limited time really won't let me talk about everything he's done. Suffice it to say, this is a prize that reflects a very, very broad base of work. Here's some of the other examples. Up here, for example, optimal executive compensation. If you want to understand why it actually makes sense for executives of publicly traded companies to make as much money as they do, you might want to read some of Tirol's work. I should note, though, that that result does not carry over to university administrators because tenure means there's limited downside and there's no real equity stake, I guess, unless it's a for-profit institution. But things like strategic entry deterrence and regulation of both vertical and horizontal mergers, and more recently, optimal regulation of banks following the financial crisis are areas to which Tirol has made substantial contributions. So in conclusion, here's Jean Tirole with his I Love TSE. TSE is the Toulouse School of Economics in France. He, along with Jean-Jacques Lafont and Jacques Hammer, basically really put the Toulouse School of Economics on the map. With this Nobel Prize, it might be fair to say that just as the Chicago School is well known among economists for contributions to our understanding of the importance of competition to economic efficiency, I won't be surprised if future generations of economists reference the Toulouse School based on Tirol's contributions to our understanding of market power and regulation and what should be done when markets aren't as competitive as we would like.
Are there any questions? So Michael, is this a quantitative, predictive kind of a theory or more qualitative? Can you tell what the right compensation for an executive is or when it's appropriate for a monopoly or single firm to have a monopoly?
The answer to that question is yes and no. The beauty of Tirol's work, and one of his main contributions, is prior to really the early 1980s, most of the work in regulatory economics relied on ad hoc assumptions about what we thought were stylized facts of the industry to which we were going to apply our regulation. Tirol is really based in very sound mathematical models. Those models include parameters that define the regulatory tools that we have at our disposal, and so we can see through his models exactly how applying a certain regulatory tool will impact the economic efficiency and outcome in the market. Now, the no part of that answer is there are other parameters in the model that rely on empirical observations, and we may or may not have really good measures of those empirical parameters. His work has led to other work by Ariel Pecas at Harvard, who's an empirical IO, industrial organization economist, work that's really starting to innovate in how we understand and estimate those empirical parameters. So our policy is getting better and better over time, but there's always things we don't know that we wish we did.
It seems like many governments might be in a position to actually do experiments with finding out, just for example, just what additional incentives you might have to apply to get a certain kind of behavior.
Yeah, governments, and also, I don't know if there's anybody from our College of Agriculture in the room, but we do have an experimental economics lab in the College of Agriculture where these experimental economists are actually trying these things out in laboratory settings, which is a nice environment in which to do this. But also, you can see differences in the way regulatory policy is implemented and the impact it has. For example, when you go to France, what you pay for your cell phone and internet and television connectivity is about 1/3 of what we pay in the U.S., and that's because they arguably have a superior regulatory mechanism in place for encouraging competition between telecommunications companies. So,
There's a question up here, Fred.
So does that imply that the regulatory mechanisms we had in place before, what is it, 2008, for the banking system and, monetized mortgages, things like that, weren't following the sorts of mathematical formulae that he had developed?
No, I would not say that's true that's true of all of them, but certainly they weren't as well thought out as we would like. I think it is fair to say that if you look at the regulatory modeling, even applied as early as the early 2000s, there were still a larger number of these ad hoc assumptions about the way we thought the market worked. And Tirol's work has really been aimed at eliminating those ad hoc assumptions and including parameters that we can actually control in the model. So, yeah, Tirol himself in an interview shortly after he won the prize was asked about bank regulation, and he said, it's really hard. So I don't know that we're going to get great answers to that anytime in the near future. So.
All right, let's thank Michael one more time.